Hey everyone, I wanted to put something together in regards to Hong Kong's district council elections that happened last night, particularly considering the record turnout and results that remarkably favored the pro democracy candidates. These elections are, of course, not as important as the LegCo elections coming up in September 2020 from a policy making point of view, but nonetheless, it probably gives us a pretty good indication of what to expect when we're ready for those elections, providing the current sentiment in Hong Kong remains more or less the same. The results really were not that surprising to me, or probably to many other people. I had said months ago that while I wasn't sure exactly how the results would look, I was betting more on the side of an increase in pro democracy camp seats. I did also correctly assume that we'd see record turnouts. That's probably a pretty obvious one, also. So there are a lot of people who are fed up with the protesters, but my theory is that people who are fed up with the protesters are first and foremost more likely to be people who are happy with Hong Kong already and its system, and therefore are more likely to be people who were already participating in the political system and voting. However, the people who were unhappy with the system and feel like the Hong Kong system doesn't adequately represent them, they were probably people who didn't participate in the elections and voting process for that very reason. However, with this being the main way for them to express themselves in the meantime, it could have very well inspired them to come out and send their message via this method. So, with that concept in mind, the increase in number of voters would have probably disproportionately come from the anti government side. If my theory is correct here, this could be one of the reasons for the sudden dramatic shift towards the pro democracy side. Of course, it's not the only reason. The government did do a terrible job of how they handled the extradition bill, which I believe was a bill that was totally reasonable, but that's something I'm going to get into in another video. However, I'd be ignorant not to admit that it would have been a real challenge for the government to have handled it any worse than they did. And the current government's inability to communicate with its people in an effective and engaging manner extends beyond this one issue, and is of course responsible in part for the result we saw last night as well. Even though it seemed pretty obvious that the pro democracy candidates would win more seats, I still had hope. I thought that the people would look at what this so called pro democracy movement is producing on the ground and the things it stands for and the ignorance that it embodies. You still today have people who think that there were protesters who were killed in the MTR station after many months without even a single one of them having a single acquaintance, friend, coworker, or family member looking for any missing people. When other Hong Kongers were kind of fed up about this ignorance and started to rip down the flowers and posters for these imaginary murdered protesters at their makeshift memorial sites, outrage ensued. Meanwhile, you have an actual person, a 70-year-old man, who's seen on camera being killed, who has a name, who has a grieving family, and his memorial was ripped apart shortly after his son was seen breaking down and crying at that site. And if that wasn't enough to create sufficient distaste and reflection for what this pro democracy movement is actually embracing and excusing, the death of this man was further marginalized by telling everyone that his son met with a pro Beijing group and was speaking in Mandarin Chinese rather, almost suggesting that this is supposed to somehow make it a little bit more okay. The systematic targeting and dehumanization of mainland Chinese is one of the most important reasons why I had hoped people would reflect on what these pro-democracy mobs really represent. Mainland Chinese have been targeted and beaten, evacuated from their school campuses due to how extreme it's become. And it's this point that should allow you to appreciate only one of the reasons why we should all be thankful that we have this buffer in place at the top of Hong Kong's leadership, which doesn't allow this kind of xenophobia to become even further institutionalized than it already is. I want to add that I don't want anybody to mistake this as a problem that only began after the protest started. The dehumanizing of mainland Chinese and discrimination against them began long before this started, in the media and on the ground. The protesters and violence from a general point of view has simply created the environment where people can start acting out on all of these nurtured xenophobic tendencies. We can of course hope for a better chief executive. I hope for one too, and personally I wish the pro-democracy lawmakers didn't vote down the proposal to make a first step towards that direction, a first step towards universal suffrage by introducing a vote with pre-screened candidates, albeit. Maybe we would have had a better chief executive than we have now, at least, had that bill passed. But especially in the current environment, a buffer of some sort is really important. Another really important thing we can soak in from this also is that we can begin to imagine how atrocities have been possible in other democracies or in other places where people supposedly stand for democratic values. To understand this point, you have to first concede that atrocities have been committed by people who have come to power through democratic systems. People are afraid to acquaint Hitler and the Holocaust to any other movement out of fear of being shamed into saying you're cheapening what happened. But what we're seeing in Hong Kong can allow you to begin to at least imagine how such a movement starts. While nothing on the scale of what happened in Germany is possible, of course, particularly because we have that buffer at the top of Hong Kong's leadership, it still already has reached pretty alarming rates, with mainland Chinese fleeing Hong Kong and living in temporary accommodations in Shenzhen even. The so-called pro-democracy movement we're now seeing is also actually far more pro-American than it is pro-democracy. And pro-American does not actually really mean pro-democracy or pro-freedom when it comes to being a subject of Americans' foreign policy. And there's plenty of examples to go out and see regarding that. This is, of course, getting into a second important reason for needing a buffer at the top of Hong Kong's leadership. But I don't want to drill down on that point too much here because I want to make a dedicated video about universal suffrage in Hong Kong that explores all of these points in regards to the risk to Hong Kong people as individuals and Chinese national security in far more depth. So like I said, I'll save that for another video. But expanding on this not really being about pro-democracy, entertaining for a second that pro-democracy means pro-freedom, it should be obvious that this movement is neither of those things. When protesters beat anyone for having a different opinion, destroy the shops of the relatives of people who said something they didn't like, or burn down the offices of political opponents, the people who are voting on the side of these mobs are not actually voting for freedom. The results of the vote last night represent something far darker and sinister than anyone on the outside actually realizes, and the need to have a chief executive that's meticulously pre-screened, particularly in the current environment, is something that any democracy-loving citizen of the world will have a pretty hard time comprehending. Before I continue, I actually want to add some important context here. Although pro-Beijing political parties only won 13% of the seats, from the numbers we have so far, it looks like they actually got 41% of the popular vote. So 41% of the people who came out want pro-Beijing representation in Hong Kong. However, based on how the system works, it doesn't mean that that group is going to be adequately represented or heard with these kinds of voting systems, in a similar way to the democratic voting systems anywhere else. But my main reason to mention this, though, is while I talk about the fears of what last night's vote might really mean, Hong Kong is far more divided than it may seem like from just taking a surface look at the numbers here. And if my theory about what I think voting in favor of the mobs means is true, there still is hope. And it appears like it won't take much of a shift to tilt the balance back in the other direction again. The two most likely ways for this to happen is for the government to improve their image, improve what they're doing, especially surrounding communications and strategies, or for these so-called pro-democracy mobs to just keep doing what they're doing. You know, destroying the city, disrupting people's lives, and assaulting the opposition. I really think you can only do that for so long before the people who support you start to reevaluate what they're really supporting. Perhaps that's just my wishful thinking. I don't know. But back to my main point about how people comprehend the word democracy. When you say you are not pro-democracy in Hong Kong, somewhat like I do, granted in less direct words usually, you will of course be tuned out by anyone who holds romantic ideas about what that word democracy means and who unconditionally equate that word with freedom, even though Hong Kong is ranked the third freest place on earth without a democracy in its fullest sense. And even though a study by Freedom House has revealed that 70% of democracies in the world are illiberal, meaning lacking the most basic freedoms. Democracy is a powerful brand name, though. People are convinced that everyone needs it without actually measuring what it actually means, what it actually produces, and what it could possibly result in when considering on-the-ground circumstances. There are, of course, people who may begin to appreciate some of the points here, but will probably still believe that democracy, even with all of its flaws, and regardless of the environment it's being proposed for, will always produce better results than the alternatives. They are wrong. China and its system is, of course, not without its problems, and that's an entirely different chapter, though, and something I want to get into in another dedicated video. But in the meantime, I'll leave you with one of my favorite talks that touches on this topic by a woman named Dambisa Moyo, who grew up with no human rights at all in Zambia. She's published multiple books on global politics and worked for some of the largest companies in the world. And she says China's system is exactly the kind of thing that her country and other countries like hers might need. The conditions and the countries she advocates this system for is, of course, very different than Hong Kong. But I share her talk simply to allow you to begin imagining and appreciate the idea that what you think about the word democracy and what you believe it can produce may be flawed. I'll leave a link to her talk in the description, and I will finish off here for now. See you guys next time.